Good evening, everybody. Thank you again for the invitation. It's really my honor to be part of this conference, and I'm really happy to be here to share my research with you all. So today my talk is challenging the dual, designing translanguaging spaces in a US Mandarin-English dual language immersion program. So in a minute, I will be explaining these terms, like what do we mean by dual language immersion program, and what does translanguaging mean? So I usually start my talk with my positionality. So I want to give you more information about myself. Who am I and where I came from? I'm origin from China, and I came to Boston University to got my master degree first in TESOL, and then I went to Boston College, got my PhD degree in curriculum instruction, and now I'm an assistant professor at UTSA, working on research in bilingual education and TESOL fields. So I consider myself as a multilingual speaker. I speak Mandarin, English, and I can also understand some Cantonese. So based on my multilingual background, so I really value this centering and leveraging multilingualism and multiculturalism as resource in classroom. And I'd like also to show you my teaching journey with bilingual students. So I was a English teacher back in China, and I did some English teaching, volunteer teaching in Cambodia. And then I went to the United States 6 years ago. I worked with students from different culture, linguistic, racial backgrounds, from different age groups, working as both English and Mandarin teacher there. So as you can see, based on my teaching experience and my transnational multilingual background, so my teaching philosophy really centers on striving to create a heterogeneous, multilingual, inclusive, and equitable learning environment for all students to really see what they can bring to the classroom and leverage those things as resources. And during my PhD study, I found translanguaging this notion, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in a minute. So translanguaging really resonates with my teaching philosophy because it really also centers on who students are and leverage what they already have in classrooms. So what is translanguaging? So according to Garcia and Levy, so translanguaging really describes, so as a practice, translanguaging describes so how bilinguals actually do bilingualism. We all know that as bi or multilingual speakers, we always engage in this kind of language mixing practices all the time. We use all the language features from our linguistic repertoire. So this kind of practices is defined as translanguaging. So bilinguals engage in flexible and fluid language practices to make meaning in different social contexts. So as a pedagogy approach, so translanguaging also acknowledges bi or multilingualism as a resource, like I said, and they strategically incorporates students' home or familiar languages in academic tasks. So in the United States here, so the language policy here is always monolingual driven. So if you are in an English classroom, students, they always have to stick to the English. They are not allowed to really use the languages other than English. But the content is usually students, they are from multilingual and multicultural background, from immigrant families. So they have their funds of knowledge that couldn't be really leveraged in classroom. So translanguaging really challenges these monolingual approaches in instruction. And now I'm gonna zoom the context specifically on my study, which so I did my study. This is actually part of my dissertation. So in a Chinese dual language immersion programs. So just to give you a little bit context information about dual language immersion programs. So here again in the US, so students have the opportunity in these programs to learn content area knowledge in two languages at the same time. So usually there is one space dedicated to English space, and there's another space. So we call them language other than English use space. So in US, we usually have Spanish English dual language immersion programs. We also have Chinese English dual language immersion programs, if that makes sense. So students, they will, for example, learn English language arts, math in English, and they also learn Chinese language arts, science, social studies in Chinese at the same time. The problem, this is a very promising model that research has been documented, many promising evidence that students can achieve bilingualism, bilingual skills, cross-cultural competence, and their academic performance are usually higher compared to the peers in non-immersion programs. So although there's some promising evidence that about this program, but one problem we are seeing right now is this program is usually structured under this traditionally very strict language separation policies. So as you can see from this picture here, so there's a very clear boundaries. So when it is English time, students, they can only use English. When it is Chinese time, for example, students are only allowed to use Chinese. So strict language separation boundary kind of reflected this parallel monolingualism, as you can tell, and have been criticized as failing to recognize the socio-linguistic realities of bilingual students. Because we all know when bilingual learners engage in their learning, they always draw upon all their linguistic resources to make meaning. They always cross these language boundaries in academic tasks. So how can we really leverage those resources in those, for example, English only space or Mandarin only space? So that is the question that I'm trying to address in my study. So to leverage bilingual learners' full linguistic repertoire as resources, so Sanchez et al., so in a recent article, so they actually are trying to promote a translanguaging allocation policy to reframe this language strict separation policy in US dual language immersion programs. So they actually argue to integrate 3 more components. So the first one is translanguaging documentation. So they urge teachers to create those kind of spaces so that you can assess what students know and can do when they use all their linguistic resources to give them a fuller picture of the learner. And they also encourage to create translanguaging rings. So translanguaging rings as ways of different scaffolding instruction that allow teachers to use students' home languages as resources when they learn the target language. And finally, they also argue to create translanguaging transformation spaces, which means create certain opportunities for bilingual students to use all their linguistic resources to read, write, and think in ways that challenge the existing linguistic hierarchies in school and society. So through integrating various translanguaging spaces into this existing language separation model, this framework offers more flexibility to instruction and assessment. Theoretically, provides a more alternative provides an alternative way to better serve bilingual students. So in my study, so I'm trying to address, so how can this translanguaging allocation policy be implemented in a Mandarin immersion classroom, right? So from theory to practice, so how can we do this as teachers, teacher educators? So my study took the methodology of participatory design research, as you can see here, so which features this trusting relationship building between researchers and teachers, and both parties are positioned as brokers of knowledge to engage in equitable forms of dialogue and listening to figure out how an educational intervention works in practice through iterative cycles of plan, act, evaluate, and reflect this kind of cycles. And to contextualize this methodology in my study. So in my case, so I'm the researcher. I worked alongside a teacher. So her name is Miss Li, with a grade 3 Chinese teacher to co-design translanguaging documentation, translanguaging rings, and translanguaging transformation spaces within and across 3 content areas. So all these content areas are taught in Chinese, Chinese language arts, science, and social studies. And this research was a year-long dialogic planning and implementation of translanguage allocation policy. So it took place from September 2018 to June 2019. So it mainly trying to address 2 research questions. So what translanguaging activities are implemented during the design process, and how do the students participate in those translanguaging spaces? To give you a little bit more information about my study context, so it occurred in a 3rd grade Mandarin classroom in a Mandarin-English dual language immersion program. So this program is part of a strand program in a public K-5 school in the US New England area. It adopts this 50-50 model. It means students will have 50% of the time studying Chinese and another 50 in English. So with this 1 language, 1 teacher, 1 classroom language allocation policy. So as you can see again here, they have clear, strict boundaries, right? So 1 language, 1 teacher, 1 classroom pretty much means, so for example, in the morning time, students, they study in 1 classroom, English classroom, and working with English teacher to study certain subject areas in English. And in the afternoon, they will go to another classroom to work with another teacher to learn content area knowledge in Chinese. So I'm looking at the Chinese part, which is the Chinese language arts, science, and social studies part. So there were 22 students in the class, and the majority of them, they were interracial and English dominant speakers. And Miss Lee was also my participant. So she is a bilingual speaker of Mandarin and English. She is originally from Taiwan. She is a very experienced teacher. She has more than 7 years teaching experience when she started this collaboration study with me. And she also holds a master's degree in applied linguistics from a US university. So data collection involved really various sets of data for triangulation purposes. So they include audio and video recordings of Miss Lee's class and our research meetings. And I was a participant observer and took field notes there. And I also collected artifacts from Miss Lee's lessons, students, and our research meetings. I also did semi-structured interviews with Miss Lee and some focal students just to get more insights about their learning experiences when we did the translanguage design during the process. So the data analysis, so I took an iterative approach to analyze my data that combines both inductive and deductive coding. So for the interest of the time in this presentation, I will specifically talk about the findings from the Chinese language arts class. So what translanguaging activities have been designed there and how students participated in those activities. So I would like to show you some data with you all so that you can gain a sense. So what translanguaging space look like and really how students participated in those spaces. So if you still remember the translanguaging allocation policy framework, they have 3 components: translanguaging documentation, translanguaging rings, and translanguaging transformation. So I'm gonna walk you through examples from each category. So the first category is translanguaging documentation. So it concerns a more holistic understanding of learners' academic performance compared to monolingual assessments. So we decided that when the goal is to assess content proficiency, so students should be freed from the limitations of using one named language only at a time. So here is an example that really demonstrates how we implemented this idea. So it's in early December. So the students were working with a complex Chinese text called 聪明的建筑. So in English is smart buildings for several sessions. So the text discusses how people around the world use different materials to build houses with various structures to accommodate to the local climate. So to assess students' if they really understood the content, we designed a short exit ticket activity to assess students' content proficiency without limiting them to use Mandarin only. Also, to signal that using English was permissible, we wrote the exit ticket instructions in English, as you can see here. And when giving the exit tickets to students, Ms. Lee also explicitly mentioned that they could use both English and Chinese in this case to craft their answers. So in the exit ticket, we asked them, so what did you learn from this text, smart buildings? Include as many details as possible. So here are some student works, as you can see. So given that most of our students were English dominant speakers, it was not surprising to see that almost all of them, they chose to use English when responding to this Chinese text, with a couple using some Chinese words in reviewing the exit tickets. So those are some translanguaging practices that we can see from the students' work samples. We saw that students displayed various levels of elaboration when they talk about their understanding of the text, smart buildings. So some discussed the different examples from the text with elaborate details, while others talked generally about house building in different weather conditions. So in summary, as you can see here, translanguaging documentation present us with a fuller picture of where they were in terms of content comprehension. And next, there are also certain moments that when Ms. Lee and I also wanted to see students demonstrate both content and language proficiency. So to really prioritize students' use of Mandarin while also offering them some wiggle room to use their linguistic resources in formative assessments. So Ms. Lee and I added certain criteria to regulate students' written output. So here's an example. So in early January 2019, the students were working on their story retelling skills in their Chinese language arts class. So in one academic task, Ms. Lee first read a Chinese text called 小柔的旅行,好玩的过山车. So in English is Rosie's Trip Roller Coaster Fun. And then she asked the student to retell the story in a written form. So in this assessment, our criteria were, so first use as many Chinese characters as you can. If you do not know how to write a character, you can use pinyin. So pinyin is actually the romanization of the Chinese characters based on their pronunciation. If you don't know neither Chinese characters or pinyin, then you can use English. So now looking at students' work on a general level, we saw that they translanguaged among Chinese characters, pinyin, and English fluidly in their written works, and most of them produced their retelling in Chinese characters with limited use of pinyin and English. So this really shows that students could still draw on all their linguistic resources to demonstrate their content understanding, but in a more structured way of using their Chinese and English to showcase their language proficiency. So now I'm moving to the second category, translanguaging rings design. So this category, so it's pretty much using students' dominant languages as scaffolding during instruction to achieve different pedagogical purposes. So we saw that by engaging students in this kind of cross-linguistic analysis through juxtaposing English and Chinese, translanguaging rings has this promise of building cross-linguistic connections and raising students' meta-linguistic awareness. So here in this example, so they were comparing and contrasting the word order, the syntax in Chinese and English. So here it is 我在美国出生. So the English translation is I was born in America. So under Ms. Lee's explicit guidance, students learned that, so in English, the place adverbial in America is always placed after the verb was born, while in Chinese, place adverbial 在美国 is usually placed before the verb 出生. So the students were more attentive to the form and grammatical structure of Chinese and could potentially become more competent bilingual readers and writers. Another quick example is translanguaging rings can also make content more accessible to all students with different levels of Chinese proficiency. So by providing English translations to certain difficult Chinese words and phrases in vocabulary list and instructions on their worksheet, Translanguaging rings promoted students' content level understanding and facilitate their task engagement in a timely fashion. So last but not least, this category is translanguaging transformation. So where students' home languages were seen as more than scaffolds, but rich resources that were connected to their cultures, creativity, and criticality. So we designed an interdisciplinary project called Culture Day Project. So aiming to build this build a culturally and linguistically inclusive community, strengthen homeschool relations, and foster students' positive identity development. So let me just tell you more details about this project. And you can see how we used both English and Chinese in a more fluid but also structured way to guide students finish this project. So it was around late January to early February in the time of Chinese New Year. So Miss Lee and her students had studied different cultures and their holidays in Chinese language arts class and the concept of immigration and identity in social studies class. So this seemed like a perfect time for students to explore and showcase their own cultures and family holiday traditions to reinforce and apply what they had learned from Chinese language arts and social studies class. So this project consists of 5 main steps. So firstly, Miss Lee sent a letter home explaining this upcoming project to family members. Since English was the dominant language in most homes, the letter was read in English, as you can see here. Students could also read this letter to get an overview of this project. And next, we gave students a worksheet written in English, instructing them to conduct interviews with family members to learn about their family origins and the one traditional holiday they celebrate. We encourage the students to use their dominant language, English in this case, in both oral and written forms, working with family members together to document information. And after the information gathering, then we ask the students to translate the English information into Mandarin. A new worksheet with outlines written in Mandarin was provided, containing sentence starters and key questions to scaffold students' writing process. So notably, students were not just doing simply word by word translation, literal translation in this case. They were also learning how to synthesize information and recontextualize their information into this Mandarin context. And after hours of working, students were then asked to use their worksheets as their basis for a PowerPoint presentation. Ms. Lee provided a template which is written in Mandarin, including the structure of the presentation and sentence starters as scaffolds. So students could choose to add pictures and background color to enrich and personalize their slides. The final step was to give an oral presentation in Mandarin in class. We gave students ample time for rehearsal. And it was really exciting to see students to showcase their projects on their presentation days. So here I'm showing some different holidays that students chose to present that represent their home and cultural traditions. So in our class, we have a variety of holiday traditions represented from China, Kazakhstan, Canada to Jewish communities. So the students were really actively engaged and asked each other's questions to expand their knowledge repertoire on different cultural traditions. During the whole process, students mobilized their full linguistic and semiotic repertoire fluidly and judiciously across named language and modalities. And we also learned more about students' family background and cultivated learners' intercultural awareness and social identity development, prompting them to think about what family heritage they have and who they were. So also for the interest of time, I'm just gonna quickly go through this example. So we also did this longicultural portrait. I'm not sure if you're familiar with this portrait. So you can students, they can visualize their cultural and linguistic identity on this portrait using different colors and explain their rationale in multiple languages. So here again, we open the translanguaging space. So first, Miss Lee did a modeling, demonstrate how her language cultural portrait looked like, and she explained her rationale in Chinese. But she also tells students, your language cultural portrait may look different from mine, right? It is your own language cultural identity, right? So this is, and you are free to use both English and Chinese or mix them together to demonstrate your rationale. So why you visualize your language cultural portrait in that way. So as you can see here again, there are some student language cultural portraits. So we were really amazed by their creativity and criticality about how they demonstrate, their different multicultural and multilingual identities. And later we did a language cultural portrait exhibition. We put all of their language cultural portrait on the window so that students from other classes, they can also came here to learn more about their classmates. So one student during the interview, so he actually shared his thoughts with me. So I really like it because then I know where they came from, where they are. It's really helpful to learn that they have different cultures so that we can treat them not bad, like all that. So as you can see, students start to have this emerging understanding of this multiculturalism and multilingualism by engaging in this translanguaging activity. So I'm gonna skip this actually due to the time. So finally, I would like to share some concluding thoughts about this translanguaging designs. So this study actually confirmed that when students' home languages and cultures were seen as resources and strategically leveraged in translanguaging documentation, translanguaging rings, and translanguaging transformation these spaces, so they were able to more fully demonstrate their academic performance and develop a meta-linguistic awareness and content understanding. Creating translanguaging spaces could also strengthen their family school connections and foster their positive bi or multilingual identity and critical consciousness. So translanguaging is more than a scaffold. However, we did encounter some challenges, such as balancing between translanguaging space and language minoritized space when students increased their use of English. So we argue that both spaces are needed and can and should coexist in dual language immersion programs. As Garcia and Clefgen argue that minoritized languages need to be protected, but they cannot be isolated. The key point lies in that translanguaging spaces need to be strategically and purposefully planned depending on different contextual factors, such as learning tasks, learning goal, students' background, needs, and levels. And this study also points out that researcher-teacher collaboration provides a promising way to generate evidence-based, practitioner-informed, and context-appropriate knowledge for curricular and pedagogical improvements in dual language immersion programs. So I hope my research can give you some ideas of designing flexible multilingual spaces in your own context to really challenge these monolingual ideologies in language education and bilingual education in general. And so here's my contact information, and you are welcome to email me or follow my Twitter if you have more questions. And I also put some of my publications, they are available in my ResearchGate website. So you are more than welcome to check them out. And thank you very much again for your time, for your listening to my research. And thank you.